Hi, I'm Julianne Burton-Carvajal, and we're going to talk today about the Year of the Mission series, which is ongoing at Museum of Monterey from November 24th, 2012 through November 24th, 2013. And the reason we chose those particular dates to open and close is we're marking the 300th anniversary of the birth of Father Junipero Serra, who was the founding Father President of the Alta California Missions, beginning in San Diego in 1769, continuing on to Monterey, which was the goal of the entire enterprise. The protected harbor, pretty protected, of Monterey was going to be the capital of Alta California, as indeed it was made within a few years of its founding in 1770. We also have here in our region Carmel Mission, which was really the extension of that second mission. The first one at the Presidio was called San Carlos Borromeo de Monterrey. Serra did not like the location. He was a wanderer. He explored. He thought it was quite lovely, that little hillside overlooking the mouth of the Rio Carmelo, which had been named in 1602, 1603 when Vizcaíno came to explore. And he had Carmelite priests with them. And when they hiked over the hill that we now call Carmel Hill, they said, this looks like the Holy Land. It looks like Mount Carmel, and that's how we have that name. In the Diocese of Monterey, we have 8 Spanish-era mission churches. That is 7 missions, plus the Rio Presidio Chapel. Carmel was named San Carlos Borromeo del Rio Carmelo in order to distinguish it. And even today, there's sometimes confusion, which is San Carlos. There's a major book published that features Carmel Mission centrally without ever naming it. It calls it San Carlos Mission, and everyone scratches their heads and goes, where's San Carlos Mission? Okay, what are we doing in this year of exhibitions? There's 4 shows, and we're sitting in the room. I'm surrounded by these glorious images taken in 1999 by Jeffrey Beckham. Jeffrey Beckham is a noted photographer, trained architect, also a painter. He very conveniently lives in Pacific Grove, but he's known across the country and beyond. And he's particularly interested in color, in vernacular architecture. By vernacular, he means popular architecture. Architecture created by regular people rather than by professionals. And in 1999, Jeffrey made one of many trips to Mexico. He'd heard for a long time about this very remote region of difficult access. Even once you're there, access is very difficult from one place to another. And that was called Sierra Gorda. It initially was named by the Spanish Cerro Gordo, which just means great big fat hill, but that evolved over time, and really it is more of a sierra. It's one mountain top and valley after another after another. Over 2 visits, Jeff spent 2 weeks documenting these churches, and behind me on the wall you see all 5 of them plus an interior of 1, because we have 6 reproductions, enlargements. I guess you'd say they're 3 by 4 feet, so they're large enlargements. That wall, as you enter the gallery, gives you an orientation. All those missions were created between 1750 and 1760. By 1770, the Franciscans who had founded them were out of the region. Why was that? Because in 1768, the Jesuits were expelled from all Spanish dominions. The Jesuits had made over 100 years a very impressive chain of missions all the way up the 1,000-mile length of Baja California. Suddenly, those missions had no one in charge of them, no one to administer. The Franciscans were called in, at Serra was called. He was no longer in Sierra Gorda. He'd spent the years between 1758 and 1768 relocated back to his training ground, which was the Apostolic College of San Fernando in Mexico City. And from there, he was in charge of the choir for a time. He also was sent to existing missions, that is, centers of conversion in central Mexico. We don't know exactly what his itinerary was during those years. He was almost sent to San Saba in Texas, which would have put him right in the path of the Apaches and the Comanches. It's highly unlikely he would have survived that assignment. But because of a massacre there, a confrontation, if I say it less confrontationally, the funder for that enterprise withdrew his offer of funds, and Serra was tapped by José de Galvez, who was sent directly by the King of Spain, and in his power mandate, he challenged and in many ways exceeded the Viceroy, who was the most powerful figure in the Spanish New World, in what was called New Spain, which is the entire American Southwest. No one really knew the extension. All of what is now territorial Mexico, Guatemala, down to Panama, of course, Baja California. Serra was put in charge of the Jesuit missions. There were over 20 of them. Immediately they tried to consolidate, and within a year, he was in charge of one of 2 expeditions to Alta California. Now, what is the connection between the missions in Sierra Gorda and the missions in Alta California? This is a question that this exhibition begins to address. It cannot thoroughly answer. We would need to really enlist a lot of specialists in order to give a full answer to that question, but this is a good year to be asking it and to be thinking about it. At least 4, I may never know if there were a significant number more, but at least 4 key missionaries in Alta California were part of that Sierra Gorda enterprise. Of course, Junipero Serra is the leader. He also came to the New World in 1749. They arrived in Mexico City January 1st, 1750. He brought with him from Mallorca 2 of his former students, and that's Francisco Palau, who became Serra's biographer, and also Juan Crespi, who was a really significant diarist and accompanied Portola on the expedition to found Monterey. So those 3 were together in Sierra Gorda. Serra volunteered them. Their missionary training was to last 2 years. They'd barely been in the country 6 months. And they go off to this place, which is 17 hours on foot or on muleback to the nearest major city, which was Querétaro. Sierra Gorda is, in fact, even today in Querétaro State. It's the extreme northern part. So a driving distance from Mexico City direct would be maybe 8 or 10 hours by modern highway. So you can imagine what kind of challenges were posed by making that trip in 1750. Okay, why are these missions significant? Well, just looking at one photograph and you'll go, oh, there's so much color here. There's so much carving. What is this carving made out of? Well, it's carved stone. How are those colors produced? They are, to this day, still produced naturally from pigments found in the area. With one exception, the blue comes from another region of Mexico. But these beautiful umbers and deep reds and oranges that you see come from the minerals in the area, including cinnabar, which is bright red and very valuable for mining things like silver, for example. So the area had some mineral wealth that the Spanish were interested in. It also was a huge territory. They were not comfortable with the fact that they had tried for 250 years, since the very early 1500s, to colonize and missionize Sierra Gorda. The Dominican order, the Augustinian order, the Franciscan order, all those attempts over that quarter millennium had failed. Serra and his group came with this renewed zeal. They were almost revivalist missionaries because they harked back in their idealism to the early years of missionization, to those heroic years. And in fact, all 5 churches used the same footprint that was used in the 16th century. That was very deliberate. They were making a conscious throwback and tribute to their missionary forefathers. It still is staggering to when you're there in the environment and you see how rugged it is and how long the distance, even by paved road, from one mission to another, and then that these are huge, they're carved in stone, they're all covered in stucco, and this magnificent exuberance of forms. And if we tried to duplicate these today, the challenge would be enormous. So then we multiply that by all those various hundreds of years. Why was Serra and his group successful when other missionaries had failed? That's a really important question that we do try to answer in the show, in the little bit of signage that we added. There's 2 panels with a handful of scattered paragraphs, and they say, "Did you know?" And each of those points gives you some insight into what was going on there. But also with Jeffrey Beckham, the photographer, in 2009, when we first premiered this traveling show, I wrote a text, and together Jeff and I designed a book on the missions of Sierra Gorda. We called it In the Footsteps of Father Junipero Serra, the 5 folk Baroque mission churches of Mexico, Sierra Gorda. For this show, I've altered the title a little bit, and I've done an excerpted version of the book. And so this is a much more economical production, and it's called Junipero Serra Before California, the World Heritage Site Churches of Mexico's remote Sierra Gorda. And in both of these, we give some background. Junipero Serra before Sierra Gorda and also after. His new missionary method that he introduced, he and his Franciscan companions in Sierra Gorda, the prehistory of that region, including the history of military conquest, because the final conquest was 1749. Serra and his group came the following year. And then a general analysis of the facades of these buildings, because what Jeffrey was fascinated by were not the insides of the buildings, but this external facade. They all have a high tower. They have what's called a convento or monastery attached. At most there were 2 priests, often only 1. Some of those today function as schools. All these churches are active parishes today, so you go on a Sunday, you'll see people coming and going from Mass. There's a large atrium, a big open courtyard in front of all of them, and anthropologists tell us that Native Americans in New Spain, or what we now know as Mexico, although they were very advanced in terms of their own creative skills, and they were builders to one degree or another of permanent structures, unlike our Alta California groups, which were not inclined to permanent structures. Yet the Mexican natives over all those couple hundred years they had to be acclimated to go inside these large structures, which the Europeans felt were the way that they wanted to worship God, by some magnificent building. One way to look at these facades is that they're sermons in stone. Another way to look at them, less metaphorically, is that they are altarpieces. We think of, and we have in California, several wonderful examples of carved, elaborate altarpieces. Just take the one at San Francisco, de Asís, Mission Dolores in San Francisco, which we know the history of, manufactured in Mexico, brought up piece by piece and reassembled for that exact space. When you think about an altarpiece like that one and you think about this facade, you see immediately they are one and the same genre of work of art. So what the Franciscans did here, and I'm not saying it didn't happen elsewhere in the New World as well, but it happened, I think, most spectacularly and uniquely here in Sierra Gorda because it was the late flowering of the Baroque. They brought the altarpieces out to the open air. They brought them to the atria so they could gather hundreds, if not thousands, of natives in this open air area and stage the worship from the porch. Some of the 5 missions also have these little capillas posas, just little outdoor chapels that were used for certain processions that took place around the atrium. So the key elements of this new missionary method in Sierra Gorda, as we understand them today, and perhaps we'll still be learning more in the future, are the following. Learn the local languages. There were several groups of people with different cultural traditions in each of those little valleys and outside of those valleys. So the missionary goal of the Spaniards had also always been urbanize, congregate, bring people together in permanent settlements. That goal was consistent in Sierra Gorda, but the missionaries learned each local language, or their respective local language, depending on where they were assigned. They lived with the people under the same conditions. They did not live separately to the degree that they could. There was this conviviality in, I guess, every sense. They demonstrated and taught agriculture, which meant clearing, introducing seed, cultivating. Why did they do that? Because they wanted the people to stay in one place rather than migrate season by season. And again, they worked along with them. There's many, even though letters and documents are few and far between from this region because of events that happened afterwards, including the reform in Mexico and then later the Mexican Revolution, the survival of documents is very thin, but still word has come down through, for example, Serra's biographer, Palau, who was right there in the same region with him, that Serra and all the other missionary friars pitched in. And they hauled stone, they mixed mortar, they helped the painters, whatever was needed, they did, hand in hand. So that was a really important example. They introduced crafts, they introduced a market economy, which had not existed before. All these were deliberate motivations to make people sedentary, urbanized, concentrated. What else? The most significant thing from our point of view in having organized this show is they invited the native peoples to share their iconographic tradition. By that I mean the symbology that was meaningful to them. From our point of view in organizing this exhibition and preparing the book, the most important of these three, well, what shall I say, this 3-part new missionary approach was the commitment to enlisting, to inviting the introduction of native iconography. That is, the religious symbology, or more simply, the religious symbols that had meaning to the native peoples, who were very conscious that they were creating new religious spaces. One of the key insights, I think, about the entire process of missionizing the New World from north to south is that the native peoples did not perceive themselves as deserting their originary beliefs for this new system of Christianity, but rather overlaying Christianity onto the beliefs that their ancestors had handed down to them. As Westerners, we tend to be either or. And so it's an important insight to think about accretion of beliefs rather than desertion of one set of beliefs and blank slate embracing of another. So Jeffrey Beckham, who has traveled all of the Americas, photographing and studying with his wife Sally Aberg the religious iconography and producing a magnificent book on color in Maya culture called Maya Color. Jeffrey states categorically that there are no other churches that invite the iconographic participation of the native peoples to the extent that these Sierra Gorda churches do. And that's indeed why he committed 2 weeks of his travel time and a lot more of his processing time to this particular complex of photographs. As curator, I chose 40 from maybe 4 times that many to become part of this traveling show. So one fascinating question, which we may never answer completely, but I think it's very worth asking, is to what degree did this experience of opening themselves to Native American image traditions, visual traditions, to what degree was there a carryover between Sierra Gorda and Alta California with this team of Serra Lasuen? Did I mention Francisco Fermin Lasuen? I may have omitted him, but Lasuen was not a Mallorcan like Serra, Palau, and Crespi. Lasuen was from the Basque region of Spain, the opposite northern part of the country. So they did not share a same regional cultural tradition, but Lasuen became one of the missionaries in whom Serra most, or on whom Serra most relied after the rebellion at San Diego. He put Lasuen in charge. When Serra died in 1784 at Carmel Mission, someone else was named as interim father president of the Alta California missions to succeed Serra, but Lasuen was his choice, and Lasuen did indeed succeed him. Serra founded 9 missions during his years, his 15 years in Alta California, and Lasuen founded another 9. There are only 21, so you see, and actually it was under Lasuen that the major construction happened. The buildings that survive, that we associate with the Spanish era, were never viewed by Serra. The sites may have been selected by Serra, but a much earlier structure would have been the one he was familiar with. The structures that we know and love are largely attributed to the Lasuen period that followed. So let me bring us back again to this question. Those 4 priests, missionary friars, would have been deeply affected by their first missionary experience, which was in Sierra Gorda, and which was, by most measures, an enormous success. And as I've said, a success after 250 years of futile efforts. So no small accomplishment. In 1770, the Franciscan order, by its own request, was removed from authority over those spectacular churches and the peoples who had built them, who made their homes beneath and around them, and who were committed to living there for future generations. That left those missions in the hands of parish priests under a bishop, very remote, in Querétaro at the closest, and a process of deterioration began. That whole process is called secularization because you're going from missionary order, which is a rule, they follow a rule they're known as regulars because of that, to a secular set of ministers or pastors, which would be the parish priests. So this is not to cast blame on anyone, but the process also occurred in California. With Mexican independence, the rapid, almost frantic succession of Mexican governments viewed California as extremely remote, as a possible drain on limited resources, and wanted to tap into the Pious Fund, which had supported the missions in Baja California. It was started by the Jesuits and for the Jesuits, and into Alta California. They wanted to appropriate those funds for other purposes. Secularization was decreed, reversed, decreed, reversed, decreed. Finally, by 1834, it was imposed in Alta California. And you had a very parallel and almost overnight deterioration of virtually all of our missions to one degree or another. Because of that deterioration that came from secularization, or was the direct result in Sierra Gorda and in Alta California, it's virtually impossible for us to have a sufficient sample of Native American religious creativity in Alta California to try to really trace what connections there would be. There is in the continental United States one magnificent example. I think I wouldn't get much argument from experts when I declare that Mission San Javier del Bac, right south of Tucson, almost viewable from the outskirts of Tucson, it's called now popularly the White Dove of the Desert, is the most magnificent mission in all of the Americas. It also is unique in that its exterior and its internal decoration, sculptures, paintings, carvings, are consistently preserved throughout its history. Through a couple quirks of fate. One of them was, what's the name, was it? Oh. We had the Alaskan purchase by Seward's Icebox, and we also had the purchase of a big portion of Arizona by a figure in American history whose name eludes me right now. And it was that transfer and the isolation of Tucson that protected that mission. Why do I mention that now? Because it is documented that the artisans came from Querétaro. So there is the link between Sierra Gorda missions and the missions of North America, not directly California, but that area which was the territory of New Mexico until exactly 100 years ago when Arizona and New Mexico became states of the Union. Here's our little publicity postcard for the entire series of the Year of the Missions, and we've also reproduced it poster size for internal use. And on the back is detailed each of the 4 shows, and I'd like to talk about the others that are upcoming. And I'll use that transition, the mention of Mission San Javier del Bac, just south of Tucson, to leapfrog us to the 3rd show in the series, which is the missions of Will Sparks. Again, this is a traveling show. There are 39 paintings that Will Sparks, who was known in California as the mission painter, 39 paintings, a series that was commissioned of him at the end of his life. And he realized that these would be his final paintings. In fact, he finished the last in the series 2 days before his death. And he was so conscious of that fact that he took his palette, took Carmine Red, which was his signature color, and he signed that palette. The palette exists to this day. If an artist signs his palette, he doesn't expect to mix paints on it any longer. As his dying wish, he expressed the hope that those mission paintings would stay together. And indeed they have. They're still intact as a set. Most recently, thanks to Terry and Paula Trotter, who own Trotter Galleries in Pacific Grove, and Carmel, who purchased them as a unit and have resisted all efforts, and believe me, there have been many, to separate out that set and sell 3 to one person and 4 to another and 1 to me. What I'm holding in my hand is the book that we created apropos of bringing the Will Sparks paintings back to the Historical Museum in Santa Barbara. Turns out there's a kind of wonderful story about this final set of paintings, but I want to begin with the link to San Javier del Bac. Will Sparks was a Missourian, studied medicine, talented artist, cartoonist, sold his first artwork at the age of 10, went on in art school, went to Europe, came back after time in Paris and trip to Italy and considerable success, including being the anatomical artist for Louis Pasteur, the great French scientist. Met Mark Twain at the St. Louis Exposition oh gosh, I'm sorry that I don't have a list of these dates in front of me, but it would have been late 1880s, early 1890s. And Twain, of course, said to him, "Go west, young man." He did. He stopped in Denver to earn some money, did some reporting, and wandered a bit throughout the Southwest. Now, this is not a good reproduction of his painting, but this is from the final series. It is his version of Mission San Javier del Bac. I wish the reproductions had been more glowing as the actual paintings, which people will see in person. So that is a lovely link between this show of Jeffrey Beckham's photographs and line drawings by Richard Perry of Santa Barbara, who's an expert in Mexican religious architecture. He's dedicated his life to that study. And our third show, which is the Missions of California in the Southwest, as painted by Will Sparks. As a historian, I really appreciate that Sparks did not limit himself to the California missions, the Alta California missions, as so many of our painters and artists did. It's an important tradition. Edward Deacon and Henry Chapman Ford began that tradition before automobile travel was possible, of going to all the missions and painting, drawing them. Sparks did that tradition from his arrival in California in the late 19th century. He based himself in San Francisco as a journalist, but he continued to travel California and the Southwest. The essay that begins this volume will be reproduced and available for visitors to that show here. And it's co-authored by Scott Shields, who's the leading historian of California art, and by yours truly. And it makes this the first monographic book on Will Sparks. So I very much look forward to that, and those paintings will look stunning in this lovely second floor exhibition room at Museum of Monterey. What's going to be happening in the interim? In the interim, we're going to take a horseback ride through the Alta California missions, and our date is going to be 1903. So Sparks was painting at that time, Deacon was painting at that time, Henry Chapman Ford was painting at that time. Automobiles were not available at that time, and we're going to take this trip in 1903 with a young cowboy of very interesting background, Jose Jacinto Mora, Joemora, and he always spelled Joe, J-O, who eventually settled in this area and lived the rest of his life here, but he was born a little ways off, in or outside of Montevideo, Uruguay. Educated on the East Coast, came from a long line of Catalan sculptors, as many as 400-year-long tradition, was the second of two brothers. His brother Francis Luis, always called Louis in the family, also became a lifelong artist of considerable note. So you actually had two brothers with two careers, Joe in the West, on and in the west, and Louis in the east. I'm holding this up because in this room, and spilling out into the whole upstairs portion of the museum, exactly 10 years ago, we did a show called Back to the Drawing Board with Joemora. Joemora lived in Pebble Beach, and one of his assistants survived him by many years, and that assistant was a bit of a string saver. Joe threw things out, and his assistant would say, "Joe, I noticed this or that in your trash. Could I take it home?" "Sure. You want that old thing? No problem." Well, this man's nephew inherited what turned out to be a magnificent cache of materials related to Joemora's long and extraordinarily creative career. And one of those items was the desk, the drawing desk that Joe cartoons here. So I put it on the cover, and I called this Back to the Drawing Board. But there is also a painting by elder brother Louis of Joe in their Massachusetts cabin, their summer retreat, painting on that very same writing desk. So we had that writing desk in this room along with other furnishings and many artworks that were photographed in Joe's studio. When Deborah Silguero, who was collections manager here, was installing that desk in the corner over to my left, she opened the little drawer, which is shown here. Joe has his cartoon characters piling out of the drawer, and in the drawer was an undiscovered drawing by Joemora. So it was just a lovely moment when it almost seemed like Joe wanted to be with us for that. So we're bringing him back to this room with the story of his mission journey. Now, these little watercolors, black and white drawings, you'll also see as I flip through here, even architectural details. There's a black and white sketch of the bells at, I forgot. Oh, sorry. I forgot I had loose pages in here. Even architectural details like these that Joe made at Mission San Miguel. He was not quite 30 years old when he made this trip. His only companion was his Philly lady and a diary. Whose diary? Remember we mentioned Juan Crespi when we were talking about Sierra Gorda and the Franciscans who accompanied Serra from Sierra Gorda to Alta California? Crespi is a key figure. Crespi accompanied Portola. Serra stayed behind 1769 in what would become San Diego. Portola, governor of the Californias, took an expedition of the soldiers who were healthy enough to make the trip, some did not survive it, looking for Monterey Bay. Who was the priest assigned? Father Juan Crespi. So in this third show, we will be featuring reproductions, giclée, very high quality reproductions from Joemora's original journals from that trip. The original journals will also be here in a covered case, and our signage will be quotations from Joe's own diaries combined with his reading matter, because at night by his campfire he was reading a copy in Spanish of Crespi's diaries from 1769 given to him by the great promoter of California the Southwest, Charles Loomis. So it's kind of a wonderful story. Peter is curator of the Joemora Trust. When I was editor of this Journal of the California Mission Studies Association, Peter and I went through Joemora's diaries from this mission trip, and we published them for the first time. So with selected illustrations, actually almost all of the illustrations, more would have been redundant. Joe's trip went from Mission San Diego up to San Juan Bautista. Joemora is the second show. We've already talked about Will Sparks, which is the third. So what's number 4? What are we going to end up with? That is, I think, the biggest challenge for me as curator, because that's a show that I've not written a book about because I've not yet put the show together. So that is going to be called, in the short title, From Ruin to Restoration. The longer title is Picturing California Missions in Ruin and Restoration, from glass plate negatives to 3D laser scans. Many people will know that the state has mandated that all unreinforced, unretrofitted buildings be retrofitted for earthquake by 2017, except for state buildings, which are exempt. Now, that means all our missions have that challenge. And being many of them 18th century buildings, those challenges are multiplied. So a major restoration is going on at Carmel Mission right now. A beautiful and very ambitious restoration already occurred earlier in this decade at the Real Presidio Chapel, San Carlos Cathedral in Monterey. Also underway are Mission San Antonio in the South County and Mission San Juan Bautista in it's San Benito County actually, but it's part of the Monterey Diocese. Mission San Miguel, which is into San Luis Obispo County, also underwent major restoration in this decade, or the past decade, due to the intervention of a serious earthquake in, I believe, 2003. So this last exhibition will also be about the technologies, the visual technologies that give us access to our missions and help us preserve and conserve them. And I consider our first technologist the great Western photographer Carleton Watkins, who began a series of mission photographs on glass plate negatives as early as 1854. That was at Santa Clara Mission, and Weston Neff, who's just published a magnificent book through the Getty Museum on Carleton Watkins glass plate negatives, has documented that very interesting story. In the 1870s and into the early 1880s, Carleton Watkins was fairly systematic, and he has some magnificent shots of Carmel Mission. I've put one here on our postcard. Also, laser scanning has come into its own over the past few years. SciArc Foundation, which has charged itself with the digital conservation through laser scanning, 3-dimensional laser scanning of 500 world monuments, has a Camino Real project and has scanned Carmel Mission Basilica to assist with that restoration and retrofit. Also Mission Dolores in San Francisco, Mission San Luis Rey, which is in Oceanside, northern San Diego County, and we hope many more during this process. So we'll go from that very primitive technique of glass plate negatives. They were this big, they had to be covered with egg white within a few minutes of shooting and then developed on the spot in a tent, whatever. That technology to this utterly magical 3D technology, which presto changeo, you can recreate the entire building or access any set of dimensions from your computer desktop. So that will be the 4th of this series. So in conclusion, I should say that a series like this, which is deeply rooted in our community, but also illustrates how our Monterey, greater Monterey community is tied in to worldwide traditions, hemisphere-wide and worldwide traditions. The leadership of the Museum of Monterey wants this to be a museum by the community, for the community, defining community as a series of concentric circles that reach ever outward. Certainly, one way to look at it is we want to tell local stories with global connections, and want to be able to challenge all visitors, find your connection within this space, because it's actually surprising and wonderful how many people can find a specific connection with their own heritage and what is represented in the collection here and in the visiting exhibitions like these. So we certainly welcome, we invite, we encourage, and we appreciate donations that will enable us to continue to organize this kind of exhibition and then to get the word out about it. The behind the scenes is pretty major for something like this, and the operational costs of repainting the room, which took a week, and redoing the lighting, those kinds of things that many visitors wouldn't even think about, all add up. So you will find, if you decide you'd like to make a donation, you will find your name under the Muchas Gracias panel just at the entrance to this exhibition room. Hope to see you here.